The billionaire's son lay motionless on the polished marble floor of the Thompson mansion, his small body trembling, eyes half open and lips pale. The maid, Grace Nkem Okoro, knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she held something tiny, dark, and glistening in her trembling palm. Her heart pounded like a drum. The butler, Mr. Bacco, froze at the doorway, his voice breaking in terror. "Grace, what have you done?" His words echoed through the massive living room where gold chandeliers shimmered above their fear. The sound of hurried footsteps thundered across the corridor. Chief A.D. Thompson, Lagos's most powerful businessman, burst into the room, his agbada sweeping behind him, his gold wristwatch flashing under the light. His eyes wide with horror darted to his son. "What happened to my boy?" he shouted. Grace raised her tear-filled eyes. "Chief, please. I didn't hurt him. I was only trying to help." "Help?" His voice cracked like thunder. "You touched my son without my permission?" Grace's fingers slowly opened. Inside her palm was something no one could name, a small, dark object still moving. Everyone gasped, and for a moment silence fell heavy. Then a faint sound cut through that silence. "Papa." The voice was soft but real, the first word the boy had ever spoken. The room went dead still. Chief Aid's jaw dropped. His son, born deaf, was speaking. His heart stopped as disbelief turned into awe. Grace's tears spilled freely. She had done the impossible. She had given sound to silence. "Papa," the boy whispered again, his voice trembling like wind against leaves. Chief Aid staggered backward, unable to breathe. The butler crossed himself in shock. Grace's body shook not from fear, but from the overwhelming truth before her. The child she had risked everything for could now speak. She didn't know how it happened. She only knew something powerful had passed through her that moment, something beyond logic, beyond medicine. But Chief Ade didn't see a miracle. He saw disobedience. "Guards!" he roared. "Call Dr. Olawale! Now!" As his men rushed in, Grace lowered her head, her heart still pounding. She whispered a single prayer. "God, please, don't let him take this wrong." Outside, the mansion's compound was already alive with sirens. The boy lay on the sofa, breathing softly, while Grace stood cornered, trembling. She wanted to explain, but words failed her. Chief Aid stood over her, his chest heaving. "You touched my son with what?" he demanded. "What's in your hand?" Grace hesitated. "It was inside his ear," she stammered. "He was in pain. I only pulled it out." Chief Aid's eyes darkened. "You could have killed him." Grace's lips trembled, but her voice found strength. "Sir," he spoke. "He called you Papa." The butler gasped again, his face pale. But the chief shook his head, rage and disbelief twisting his features. "No, that's not possible." Yet, deep down, something cracked inside him, a sound he had never heard before, his son's voice. Ethan, or Adiola, as his mother once called him, sat upright now, blinking at the noise around him. For the first time in his life, he looked confused by sound. The ticking clock, the humming air conditioner, the pounding of his father's voice, all filled his world at once. He covered his ears, trembling, as if the world was suddenly too loud. Grace tried to go near him, but the guards blocked her path. "Please," she begged. "He's scared. Let me help him." Chief Aid turned sharply, his voice colder than marble. "Enough! You've done enough already." As they led her away, Adiola reached out, tears in his eyes, his small voice breaking through again. "Grace!" It was the loudest word he had ever spoken, and the last she heard before the guards dragged her toward the security room. Inside the dim corridor, Grace's heart shattered. She whispered again, "Lord, if this was your will, please make them see." The sound of the boy's cry echoed faintly through the walls, soft yet piercing. It was the first sound of love breaking through 10 years of silence. But inside the mansion, the air thickened with tension and disbelief. Chief Aid, still trembling, looked down at his son, a boy reborn into sound, and whispered to himself, "If this is true, then what else have I been blind to?" The Thompson mansion stood in Banana Island like a sleeping lion, beautiful, quiet, and dangerous in its silence. The marble floors gleamed under the glow of imported chandeliers. The walls were lined with art that cost more than some families earned in a lifetime. Yet, for all its wealth, there was a coldness no gold could melt. The staff moved like shadows, their footsteps soft, their eyes low. No one laughed here. No one dared. Because Chief Aid Thompson, the master of the house, did not like noise. Not since the day his wife died giving birth to their only child, Adiola. From that day, silence became law. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of grief. Even the wind that entered this house seemed to tiptoe. The chief was a man of power, contracts with oil companies, lands across states, influence in politics. But beneath the agbada and the gold cufflinks lived a heart bruised by loss and chained by guilt. He would have given every naira he owned just to hear his son call him Papa. But 10 years had passed, and all he heard was silence. Grace Nkem Okoro arrived at that mansion one rainy evening. The city lights of Lagos glimmered faintly through the storm. She stood outside the tall black gate with her small nylon bag, her heart pounding. The security guard eyed her curiously. "You sure Sadam invite you?" he asked. She nodded, clutching the letter of employment tight. Inside, the butler, Mr. Barco, led her through the marble hallways with little emotion. "No talking unless spoken to," he muttered. "The chief hates noise, and never go near the boy. Just clean your area and keep moving." Grace nodded respectfully, but when she saw Adiola for the first time, her breath caught. The boy sat alone by a wide window, staring at the rain. He wasn't watching it fall. He was reading it, as if each drop carried a message only he could see. There was sadness in his small face, the kind Grace knew too well. She had seen that same look years ago, in her little brother Daniel before he died. Daniel had lost his hearing after a strange illness swept through their Enugu village. Grace was 12 when it happened. Her mother had carried Daniel on her back from one clinic to another, begging for help they couldn't afford. The doctors spoke big English and handed them papers full of numbers. When the bills came, they walked home in silence. Daniel never heard again. He would sit by the window and tap the wooden frame, trying to feel vibrations of sound he would never know. One morning, Grace woke up and found him cold. Her mother wept until her voice vanished. That day, Grace made a promise before God. "If I ever see another child like Daniel, I won't walk away." It was that promise that brought her to Lagos. It was that promise that now made her heart ache each time she saw Adiola, sitting alone in his world of silence. Days passed quietly in the mansion. Grace cleaned, cooked, polished, and prayed. Every night she washed her uniform by hand and ironed it carefully for the next day. She avoided trouble and stayed invisible like a ghost among the living, but her eyes always searched for Adiola. Sometimes she saw him playing with his toy cars, lining them up neatly by colour, or watching the garden fountain for hours. The staff treated him like a fragile ornament, something expensive but untouchable. They whispered superstitions when they thought no one was listening. "If fit be curse," one cook said. "You no see as the boy quiet past ghost?" Grace didn't believe that. She believed silence wasn't a curse. It was a wound that needed care. So one morning, when she found a small drawing on her cleaning cart, a stick figure of a woman and a boy holding hands, she smiled. She knew who had drawn it. That was how their friendship began. Not with words, but with little acts of kindness between two souls the world ignored. Slowly, the boy started leaving things for her, too. Tiny toys on her cleaning tray, a folded paper boat on her bucket, a half-eaten biscuit on the staircase. Each one was a message that said thank you in a language without sound. Grace began teaching him small hand signs. He learned quickly, his eyes bright with curiosity. When she made a heart shape with her fingers, he smiled for the first time. It was a fragile, trembling smile that melted the walls of her heart. But not everyone was happy about it. One evening, as she dusted the dining room, Mr. Bacco approached her sharply. "You are here to work, not to play nanny," he said. "The chief will not like this." Grace bowed her head. "Yes, sir." But her spirit did not bow. That night, while everyone slept, she sat by the kitchen window whispering into the darkness, "God, please show me how to help this boy. Don't let him end up like Daniel." Morning came, and with it, the first sign of something strange. Adiola sat under the mango tree in the garden, scratching his ear and frowning. Grace noticed it while carrying a basket of laundry. She walked closer and signed softly. "Are you okay?" The boy shook his head. She knelt beside him and gently tilted his head toward the sunlight. Then she froze. Deep inside his small ear, something dark glistened faintly. It wasn't wax. It wasn't dirt. It looked alive. Grace blinked, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her. Her heart began to race. She wanted to tell someone, but she remembered Mr. Bacco's warning and the chief's temper. And besides, the boy looked terrified when she signed. "Doctor?" He shook his head quickly, signing back. "No doctors." They hurt. His small hands trembled. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The image of that dark thing inside his ear haunted her. She knelt beside her bed, whispering, "Lord, guide me. I'm not a doctor, but I can't watch this child suffer." And with that prayer, fate began to move. Days turned into weeks, and the Thompson mansion grew quieter still. Even the walls seemed to listen for the sound that never came. Chief Ade's empire outside was expanding. Oil contracts in Abuja, real estate projects in Ikoyi, a new private hospital under his company's name. But inside his home, life stood still. Each evening he returned to find the same silence greeting him. The boy sat by the window tracing shapes on the glass. The servants walked on tiptoe. And Grace, though new, had learned that this silence was not peace. It was sorrow pretending to sleep. She could feel it in every step, every room. It was the kind of silence that follows grief, too long ignored. She noticed that even the chief's footsteps carried loneliness, a heavy, echoing sound that reminded her of someone lost but refusing to admit it. One evening, the chief came home early. He stopped at the living room doorway and watched his son from afar. Adiola sat on the floor, lining his toy cars in perfect rows. Grace was in the corner, quietly folding laundry. When she smiled at the boy, he looked up and mimicked her smile. It was small but warm. Chief Ade frowned slightly. He wasn't angry, not yet, but it stirred something strange inside him. He had seen many people fake kindness to his child before. Doctors, nurses, teachers, all pretending until their patience ran out. He didn't trust easy smiles. "You," he said sharply. Grace turned quickly, startled. "Yes, sir." His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing there?" "Just folding clothes, sir. I pay you to clean, not to play." The words were cold, each one cutting deep. Grace bowed. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." But Adiola suddenly stood up, walked over, and held her hand. The chief's chest tightened. For a long second he said nothing. Then, with a wave of his hand, he turned away. "Dinner in 10 minutes, he muttered. His voice trembled just slightly, a hint of something breaking. Later that night, the mansion's lights dimmed. Everyone had gone to bed except Grace. She sat by her small window in the servants' quarters, the sound of the generator humming in the distance. Her heart was heavy. She kept seeing the boy's ear, that dark, moving shadow buried deep inside. What if it was alive? What if it was killing him slowly? But she couldn't speak up. Not after the chief's warning. She opened her small Bible and traced her fingers across the verse her mother once underlined. Faith without works is dead. The words burned into her. She whispered, "Then I must do something." The rain started outside, soft and steady. Grace stood, wrapped her shawl and walked barefoot through the long corridor. The air smelled of polish and perfume, but beneath it, she could sense fear, the mansion's unspoken ghost. She stopped outside Adiola's door. It was slightly open. A dim lamp glowed within, casting shadows on the walls. The boy sat on his bed, awake, clutching his ear again, his small face twisted in pain. Grace stepped inside quietly. "It hurts," she signed. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Let me see," she whispered. He hesitated, then leaned forward. The light touched his ear. And again she saw it, that faint shimmer deep inside like a dark pearl shifting when he moved. Her pulse quickened. "Oh Lord," she breathed, "help me do no harm." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver pin she used to fix her uniform. Her hand trembled. Grace, think well," she murmured to herself. "You no be doctor." But then she saw the boy's tears, and something inside her refused to wait any longer. She prayed under her breath, "Daniel, guide my hands." As she leaned closer, the door behind her creaked softly. She froze. Slowly she turned her head. And there stood Chief Aide in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the corridor light, his eyes blazed with fury and fear. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but heavy enough to shake her bones. Grace stood up instantly, hiding the pin behind her back. "Sir," he was in pain. "I was only trying to help." The chief stepped forward, his tone like thunder wrapped in restraint. "Help? You dare touch my son? You think your village tricks can heal what billions couldn't?" The words pierced deep. Grace lowered her head, tears gathering. "I meant no harm." "Enough," he snapped. "Go to your room." The boy watched, frightened, his small hands moving, trying to sign something. "Don't go." But the chief didn't understand sign language. He only saw a servant overstepping. Grace bowed silently and left, her shadow long and broken on the marble floor. That night she lay awake, trembling. The rain had stopped, but her heart hadn't. She kept hearing the chief's voice, cold, final. Yet louder than his anger was the image of the boy's ear, and the strange thing that didn't belong there. She could feel it in her spirit, something evil, something unnatural. Maybe it wasn't just sickness, maybe it was destiny asking her to act. In the stillness of that night, she whispered into the dark, "If I am wrong, Lord, stop me. But if this is what you want, give me courage." Her tears fell onto her bedsheet as she prayed. Outside, thunder rolled far away, not in anger but in warning. Something was coming. The mansion slept, unaware that before the next sunrise, one act of courage would change everything. The mansion slept beneath a sky thick with clouds. The rain had stopped, but thunder still rolled in the distance as if heaven itself was holding its breath. Grace moved through the hallway barefoot, the hem of her wrapper brushing the marble floor. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared someone might hear it. When she reached Adiola's door, she hesitated. The faint glow from the lamp spilled across the corridor, painting her shadow long and trembling. She whispered, "Lord, if this is wrong, forgive me. But if you sent me here, give me courage." Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The boy was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and restless, his small hands clutching his ear. "It hurts," he signed weakly. Grace sat beside him, her hands shaking. "I'll help you," she whispered. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the silver pin. It gleamed faintly under the lamplight, like a knife made of moonlight. She knelt and tilted his head toward her. "Hold still, my son," she whispered softly, though he couldn't hear her words. His breathing slowed. She could see the faint pulse in his neck, his small chest rising and falling. Carefully, she moved closer, peering into the ear. The same strange darkness stared back at her. Not like wax or dust, but something alive, something that shifted when the light touched it. She took a deep breath and whispered, "In Jesus' name." The pin trembled between her fingers as she gently touched the edge of the darkness. For a moment nothing happened. Then she felt resistance, soft, sticky and warm. She pulled slowly, praying under her breath. Something slid out, wet and glistening. When it landed in her palm, she gasped. It was black, round and faintly twitching, like a living bead. Grace froze. The boy blinked, then frowned as if feeling something strange in the air. His small hand touched his ear. Then suddenly his eyes widened. He gasped, clutching his chest. Grace's heart stopped. "Adeola?" she whispered. He looked around, confused. Then softly a sound came from his lips. Broken, uncertain but real. "Grace." Her entire body went numb. The sound hit her like lightning. She dropped the pin, tears bursting from her eyes. "You spoke," she cried. "You can hear me?" The boy covered his ears suddenly, flinching at the ticking clock, the hum of the fan, the sound of her voice, all rushing at him for the first time. "It's okay," Grace said, sobbing. "You're hearing for the first time." His lips quivered. "Papa," he whispered. The door burst open. The butler stood there, his face ghost white. "What on earth?" he began, but froze when he saw the boy moving his lips. "He can speak." Grace turned, trembling. "He can hear, sir! He can hear!" The butler stumbled backward, shouting, "Chief Aid! Chief, come quickly!" The noise made Adeola flinch and cry. Grace hugged him close. "Don't be scared, my boy. It's okay. You're safe now." Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor. Chief Aid appeared, his face pale as death. "What is going on?" he demanded. The butler pointed at Grace. "She touched him again, sir. And look at the boy." Chief Aid's eyes followed, and what he saw shattered every wall around his heart. His son looked up, trembling, and whispered, "Papa." The sound was soft but unmistakable. For a moment the mighty chief could not move. 10 years of silence collapsed into that one word. "Papa." It rang in his soul like a church bell after a storm. His eyes filled with tears, but disbelief took over. "What did you do to him?" he barked, voice cracking. "What did you put in his ear?" Grace shook her head, crying. "I only removed something that shouldn't be there. Please, sir." "He can hear now." "You could have killed him," Chief roared. Guards rushed in. "Take her away." "No," Adeola screamed, the loudest sound he had ever made. But his voice was drowned by the chaos. Grace was dragged away, her cries echoing down the marble hall. The last thing she heard was the boy's voice calling her name. "Grace! Grace!" A sound both beautiful and breaking. The mansion was chaos. Servants whispered. The chief paced like a wounded lion. Outside, sirens wailed as the ambulance arrived. The boy sat on a stretcher, still clutching his father's sleeve. "Grace helped," he said weakly, but the chief couldn't look at him. "Stay quiet, my son," he muttered, voice trembling. "We'll get you help." In the corridor, 2 guards stood beside Grace, her wrists bound, her uniform stained with tears. She stared at the floor, whispering prayers under her breath. Every sound, the engines, the footsteps, the doctor shouting orders, stabbed at her heart. The ambulance doors slammed shut, carrying away the boy she had just freed from silence. At the hospital, fluorescent lights burned bright over clean white walls. Machines beeped. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. Chief Aid stood behind the glass window, watching his son surrounded by doctors. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He had seen many things in his life, business wars, betrayals, even death. But nothing had ever shaken him like this. His son had spoken. He had heard. For 10 years, no medicine or money had achieved that. Yet one maid with trembling hands had done it. He felt anger and awe wrestling inside him. A doctor stepped out of the room, removing his mask. "Mr. Thompson, your son's hearing has returned, at least temporarily." Chief blinked. "Temporarily? What do you mean?" We found irritation in his ear and traces of a foreign organism. Something biological. We've never seen it before. Chief frowned. An organism? Yes, sir, the doctor said. It may have been there for years, blocking sound transmission. The removal caused a sudden release. Chief's heart dropped. You mean, all these years the doctors missed it? The doctor hesitated. It's possible. We'll know more after tests. Chief turned away, his hand shaking. 10 years of specialists, hospitals, and millions spent. And all along, a maid's eyes had seen what none of them did. Grace sat in the security room nearby, her hands cuffed, her soul exhausted. Through the small window, she saw the chief pacing and the boy on his hospital bed. Lord, she whispered, don't let them punish me for doing right. Hours passed. The boy slept, his breathing steady. The chief sat beside him, eyes red. The doctor returned with files. Sir, there's something else, he said quietly. One of the reports contains an irregular note. It looks financial. He handed him a folder. Chief read the words and froze. Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Thompson account remains active. His stomach tightened. He read it again, slowly realizing what it meant. The hospitals had kept his son deaf. On purpose. They had made his pain profitable. His lips quivered. You devils, he whispered. You sold my child's suffering. He walked out trembling, past reporters waiting at the entrance. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. He ignored them. Inside, he saw Grace through the glass window. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the billionaire and the maid, the man of power and the woman of faith. Then, quietly, he said to the guard, Release her. The guard hesitated. Sir? I said release her. Grace was unshackled. She rose slowly, wiping her tears. When she looked up, she saw something she never expected. Chief Aide bowing his head slightly in gratitude. The next morning the sun rose over Lagos like gold poured across the city's skyline. In the hospital room, light streamed through the blinds, touching the sleeping boy's face. Chief Aide sat by his bedside, still wearing yesterday's suit. He hadn't slept. His mind was full of voices, not of others, but of himself. You failed him. You trusted money more than mercy. He sighed deeply. Grace stood by the doorway, unsure if she was welcome. You can come in, he said quietly. She stepped closer, clutching her small Bible. How is he? Resting, the chief replied, his voice gentler than before. For a while neither spoke. The beeping machines filled the silence. Then, softly, the chief said, How did you know? Grace lowered her gaze. I didn't. I just listened. Not to his silence, but to his pain. Her words struck him like truth spoken by an angel. He rubbed his temples. I spent 10 years trying to fix him with science. But you looked with the heart. Grace smiled faintly. Sometimes, the heart sees what money can't. The chief nodded slowly, his voice cracking. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, she replied softly. You're a father. Fear makes even good men blind. His eyes glistened. You have faith, he said. And you have a gift. When Adiola woke, his small voice broke the air like music. Papa. The chief's eyes filled again. I'm here, my son. The boy turned his head. Where's Grace? She's here too. The maid stepped closer, his face lit up with joy. Grace, he whispered, you helped me. She smiled through tears. God helped you, my dear. I only obeyed. The chief looked at her, something shifting inside him. Respect, humility, perhaps love. You've changed my life, he said quietly. Not just his. Grace shook her head. It's God who changes hearts, sir. We just listen. Outside, the city roared to life. Car horns, voices, the sound of a living world. For the first time, Adiola smiled at the noise. Later that day, as the chief stood at the window overlooking the hospital parking lot, he made a vow. No child will ever suffer what mine did again. he murmured. Grace heard him and turned. You can change it, sir. You have the power. He nodded. I will. His tone was steady, purposeful, the voice of a man reborn. The storm that had hovered over his life was beginning to clear, but both of them knew this was not the end. The truth about the hospital, about the corruption that had silenced a child for profit, still waited to be told. Grace looked out at the morning sun and whispered, "Let the world hear now." By noon, news had already spread across Lagos. Billionaire's deaf son suddenly speaks after Maid's touch. It flooded radio headlines, WhatsApp groups, and gossip shows. Every media outlet wanted answers. Reporters gathered outside St. Nicholas Hospital, cameras ready, microphones raised. Chief Aide sat in the hospital conference room, his phone buzzing endlessly. Each call felt like judgment. Investors, politicians, friends, everyone demanded an explanation. He ignored them all. He was staring at the medical files spread before him, proof that the hospital had profited from his son's pain. The words burned like fire on paper. Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Grace sat quietly at the corner of the room, her uniform wrinkled, eyes still swollen from tears. She wasn't used to cameras or attention. She only wanted peace, but she could sense that this moment wasn't about her anymore. It was about truth. The chief finally stood. His eyes, once cold and commanding, now burned with something new. Conviction. Call the press, he said calmly. The doctor hesitated. Sir. That may not be. Call them, he repeated. The world will hear today. When the doors opened, flashes blinded him. Reporters leaned forward, shouting questions. Chief Thompson, is it true your maid healed your son? What did she do? Is it witchcraft or miracle? Are you suing the hospital? The chief raised his hand. Silence fell gradually, curiosity humming beneath it. He walked to the microphone, his gold cufflinks glinting in the light. For 10 years, he began, his voice deep and steady. I believed my son would never hear my voice. I paid for the best hospitals, the finest doctors, and every promise that money could buy. But last night, a maid, with nothing but faith, did what millions could not. A murmur swept through the crowd. The chief continued. This morning, I discovered something even more shocking. My son's condition was not fate. It was fraud. These files show how hospitals kept my son deaf to keep my money flowing. Gasps echoed. He held up the documents. They made a business out of my child's silence. The cameras clicked rapidly. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. The chief's voice softened. But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to change the story. He turned toward Grace. Because one woman's compassion reminded me that true healing starts with listening. All eyes turned to Grace. She froze, gripping the edge of the podium. Sir, please, she began, but he shook his head gently. No, Grace. The world must know who you are. He gestured for her to step forward. Her heart pounded, but she obeyed. The cameras zoomed in. The bright lights made her blink. I didn't do anything special, she said softly. I just saw a child in pain and couldn't walk away. Maybe that's what we all need to do. Stop walking away. Her words cut through the noise like a prayer. The crowd fell silent. One reporter lowered his mic and whispered, She sounds like she's preaching. By the time they left the room, Grace's name was already trending. On Twitter, hashtags read, One Grace of Lagos, and the boy who heard. Yet, she didn't smile. She just looked up at the cloudy sky and murmured, To God be the glory. The chief stood beside her, his eyes distant. The same world that doubted you will soon call you a miracle, he said quietly. But remember, even miracles must carry humility. She nodded. I know, sir. I only pray this helps other children like him. That evening, the sun set behind the hospital towers, glowing red like a promise. But behind that beauty, something darker stirred. Lawyers from the implicated hospitals were already calling, threatening lawsuits, whispering influence. Chief Aide knew this was only the beginning of a war, not of guns, but of truth. He turned to Grace. "They'll try to bury this." She met his gaze steadily. "Then let's make it too loud to silence." The next day, Lagos awoke to a different kind of noise. Every TV and radio station carried the story. Churches preached about faith. Markets buzzed with gossip. Even street vendors paused to talk about the maid who made the deaf boy hear. But inside the hospital's quiet ward, Grace avoided the spotlight. She spent the morning cleaning Adeola's bed, folding his clothes, and teaching him how to recognize the sounds around him. The flutter of birds outside, the rhythm of rain on glass, the soft tone of a mother's lullaby from a passing corridor. Each time he recognized a sound, he would giggle with pure wonder. It was the laughter of discovery, and it filled the room like sunlight. Chief Aide watched silently from the doorway. His son's laughter was a melody he never thought he would hear. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Grace said softly without turning. "The sound of joy." The chief nodded, his throat tight. "I never realized how empty silence could be." Grace smiled faintly. "Silence isn't bad. It's only lonely when no one listens." Her words settled in him like scripture. He spoke after a long pause. "Grace, I want to make this right, not just for my son, but for every child like him. I'm starting a foundation. Free medical care for children with hearing loss, and I want you to lead it." Grace turned sharply, eyes wide. "Sir, me? I'm just a maid." "No," he said firmly. "You're the reason my son can call me Papa. That makes you more than any title." Tears welled in her eyes. She whispered, "Thank you, sir, but all glory to God." He smiled. "I believe he sent you here for this." For the first time, both of them laughed softly together, a sound that felt like healing. Hours later, Adeola sat by the window, drawing pictures with coloured pencils. He pointed to Grace and said slowly, "She's my angel." Grace covered her mouth, holding back tears. The chief knelt beside his son. "She is," he agreed. The boy grinned, repeating the word, "angel," as if testing its sound on his tongue. Then he turned to Grace again. "I love sound," she smiled, her voice trembling. "And sound loves you too, Adeola." As night fell, the three of them sat quietly together. No wealth, no power, just love. The air hummed with peace. But the story wasn't over. The chief still had to face the world's questions and the system's corruption. He looked out the window at the city lights and said, "Tomorrow we start over." Grace nodded, with truth. If you've been following this story so far, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs a little faith today. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Grace? Would you have taken that risk? The following morning, the world watched live as Chief Aide addressed the nation from the hospital's courtyard. The crowd was enormous. Journalists, activists, families with deaf children. Cameras flashed. The chief stood at the podium, Grace beside him in a new, neatly pressed gown. Adeola sat in front, wearing headphones, smiling shyly at the sound of people cheering. Chief Aide began, "Yesterday, I discovered that the true wealth of a man is not in his account balance, but in his ability to listen. For 10 years I lived among noise but heard nothing. My son's silence was a mirror showing me my own." The audience listened, some in tears. But one woman, with no money or degree, taught me that compassion can perform miracles. Her name is Grace Nkem Okoro, and today she reminds us that kindness still exists. Applause erupted. Grace stepped forward hesitantly. "All I ever wanted was to help a child," she said. "I didn't plan a miracle. I only obeyed my heart. If we all did that, this world would heal faster." Her voice shook, but her courage grew with every word. So, to every mother, every father, every servant, Every worker, don't ignore pain. Sometimes the miracle God wants to send passes through your hands. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet. The chief lifted a document high. From today, the Adiola Foundation for Child Hearing and Hope will offer free care to any child with hearing loss, regardless of wealth or background. Cheers broke out. Reporters clapped. A few even wiped their eyes. Adiola stood, waved at the cameras, and shouted proudly, "I can hear!" The entire courtyard roared in joy. That night back at the mansion, everything felt different. The silence that once haunted the house was gone. Laughter echoed in the halls. Grace was no longer a maid, she was family. The chief no longer walked like a man chasing ghosts. He sat in the garden watching his son chase butterflies and said softly, "This is the sound of Grace." Grace smiled, the moonlight touching her face. "Chief," she whispered, "you've learned how to listen." He chuckled gently. "And you taught me." For a long time they sat there, the billionaire, the maid and the boy who could finally hear, under the quiet hum of Lagos at night. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? What lesson did you learn from Grace's courage? Weeks passed, and the Adiola Foundation for Child Hearing and Hope began its work. The mansion that once echoed with silence now buzzed with purpose. Desks were moved in, doctors hired, and children from across the country arrived daily for free ear treatments. Mothers wept. Fathers knelt in gratitude. Grace walked among them with quiet humility, her white dress simple, her smile sincere. To many she was Madam Grace. To the children she was Auntie Grace, the woman who made the deaf boy hear. But deep inside, she still felt like the maid who once prayed in fear. Chief Aid had changed too. The man who once measured his worth by contracts now measured it by compassion. He worked beside Grace, donating equipment, sponsoring free clinics in rural areas. The media called him the billionaire who found his heart. Yet behind every success, enemies watched. The corrupt hospital board he had exposed was furious. They filed lawsuits, leaked lies to the press, and whispered that the maid's miracle was witchcraft. One morning, Grace found her picture on a newspaper with the headline, "Was it really God?" Or, something darker? She trembled as she read. Chief Aid tore the paper in half. "Let them talk," he said. "Truth defends itself." But the attacks grew worse. Threatening letters, anonymous calls. One night, as Grace walked home from a clinic outreach, a car followed her slowly. She prayed under her breath, clutching her Bible. When she turned the corner, headlights flashed behind her. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a side alley. She screamed, but it was Chief Aid's security man, Yusuf. "Madam Grace." "I beg," he whispered urgently. "Dem people no one make you reach tomorrow." Her knees went weak. "Who?" "The hospital people," he said. "You don't expose their lie. They fit do anything." Back at the mansion, Chief Aid's face was grim. "They think fear will silence us," he said. "But they forgot. We've already broken silence once." Grace nodded, trembling but resolute. "Let's answer fear with faith." The next day she stood beside the chief at another press event, this time not as a victim, but as a voice. "They called it witchcraft," she said, looking into the cameras. "But witchcraft doesn't heal. Love does." Her words rippled through the nation. Churches quoted her. Schools wrote essays about her. In that moment, Grace became more than a maid or a miracle. She became a movement. By the second month, donations poured in. The foundation expanded to Enugu, Kano, and Port Harcourt. Volunteers signed up daily. Grace worked tirelessly, travelling across states, comforting mothers and praying for children before each procedure. "Miracle begins where love refuses to stop," she often told them. Each time a child heard for the first time, she wept quietly, remembering Daniel, her late brother. It felt like God was healing him through every child she helped. Meanwhile, Chief Aidy's transformation was total. The once feared tycoon was now called Papa Adiola, a man who gave more than he owned. He sold 2 properties and built a rehabilitation centre for families with disabled children. But humility came with cost. Some of his old business partners mocked him. "You're wasting billions on sentiment," one said during a meeting. Chief smiled faintly. "Then maybe sentiment is what we've all been missing." That night, Grace overheard him praying in his study for the first time. His deep voice broke as he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for sending Grace to teach me how to listen." But storms always return. The lawsuit trial began in Lagos High Court. The hospital's lawyers claimed the foundation was exploiting faith for fame. They accused Grace of practicing unverified traditional healing. The courtroom filled with reporters, murmuring skeptics, and curious onlookers. Grace sat quietly beside the chief, holding her Bible. When asked to testify, she stood calmly and said, "I'm no doctor. I only saw pain and chose not to ignore it. If that is a crime, then love itself is guilty." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused before speaking. "Mrs. Okoro," he said slowly, "this nation needs more people who see as you do." He struck the gavel. Case dismissed. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters surrounded her again. "Madam Grace, how do you feel winning the case?" She smiled. "This wasn't my victory. It was God's way of saying compassion must never be silenced." Chief Aide stood proudly beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've made me believe again," he whispered. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "It was never me, Chief. It was always him." That evening, as the sun dipped over the lagoon, the 3 of them, Chief Aide, Grace, and little Adeola, stood at the garden fountain. The same fountain that once symbolized silence now sang with the sound of water, laughter, and hope. "You see that, my son?" Chief said softly. "Peace has a sound too." Months later, Grace received an invitation from the United Nations Health Board. They had heard of her story, the maid who sparked a revolution of listening. They invited her to Geneva to speak about compassion-driven healthcare in Africa. She almost fainted when she read it. "Me? Go abroad?" she gasped. Chief Aide laughed warmly. "The world needs to hear what Lagos has already heard." He arranged her passport, clothes, and flight, refusing to let her travel alone. "I'll be there with you," he said. At the UN auditorium, faces from every nation filled the seats. Cameras flashed as Grace stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple white gown with a green sash, symbolizing Nigeria. The moderator whispered, "You have 5 minutes." She nodded and began softly. "My name is Grace Nkem Okoro. I was once a maid, cleaning the house of a man whose wealth could buy almost anything, except the sound of his son's laughter. When love met silence, a miracle happened." The room went still. Her voice grew stronger. "I learned that healing is not just medicine. It is attention. It is kindness. It is listening. And listening," she said, placing her hand over her heart, "is the greatest sound in the world." When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Delegates rose to their feet. Some cried. The Nigerian ambassador himself walked up and said, "Madam Grace, today you made our nation proud." Chief Aide smiled from the audience, tears streaming down his face. In that moment, every pain, every insult, every sleepless night became worth it. Grace bowed her head humbly, whispering, "To God be the glory." That night, she and the chief stood on a hotel balcony overlooking Geneva's glittering lake. "You've done something no money could," he said quietly. She smiled. "And you did something no pride could? You listened." They both laughed softly. The wind carried their laughter across the lake, mingling with the sounds of distant bells. Grace looked up at the stars and whispered, "Daniel, your sister kept her promise." When Grace and Chief Aide returned from Geneva, Lagos welcomed them like heroes. Crowds gathered at Murtala Mohammed Airport, waving banners. "Welcome home, Madam Grace!" and "Our Angel of Lagos." Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions. Grace smiled shyly, clutching her small handbag, as though afraid the moment might vanish. Chief Aide placed a protective arm around her shoulder. "This is not fame," he whispered. "It's testimony." She nodded. The boy, Adiola, waved excitedly at the crowd, headphones around his neck, humming to a rhythm only he could hear. The following weeks were filled with invitations. Churches wanted Grace to speak. Universities wanted to honor her. Even the government offered to name her among Nigeria's 100 most influential women. But Grace turned down many offers. "I'm not chasing recognition," she told the chief. "I just want to keep helping the children." He smiled. "And that's exactly why they recognize you." The foundation grew rapidly. Satellite clinics opened in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, all bearing the inscription, "Inspired by Grace." One evening, after a long day at the new clinic's opening in Abuja, Grace sat alone on the hotel balcony. The city lights shimmered below like stars trapped on earth. She remembered her mother's words. "When God lifts you, kneel deeper." Tears filled her eyes. "Lord, keep me small enough to hear you," she prayed. Chief AD joined her, 2 cups of tea in his hands. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly. "I'm just thinking," she replied. "When I was scrubbing floors, I never imagined the world would listen to my voice." "That's because true power whispers," he said. "You didn't shout. You served." The next morning, tragedy struck. News broke that one of the corrupt hospital executives had been found dead in his car. The media twisted the story, implying Grace's foundation had driven him to suicide. Trolls flooded social media with hate. "That maid brought curse," one post read. "Her miracle was juju." Chief Aide's PR team went into crisis mode, but Grace was shaken. "They're twisting the story," she whispered. "They'll always twist truth," Chief said. "But truth is like sunrise. It may hide for a night, but it cannot stay gone." Grace nodded slowly. "Then we'll keep shining." Months passed, and peace slowly returned. The foundation's work spoke louder than lies. Thousands of children regained hearing. Mothers who once cried in silence now danced in joy. In one outreach at Onitsha, a mother knelt before Grace, shouting, "My son can hear! My son can hear!" The crowd erupted in song. Grace smiled, tears flowing freely. Behind her, Chief Aide watched quietly, humbled by the miracle he had once doubted. But even in joy, life has lessons. One afternoon, Grace collapsed during a clinic session. Doctors rushed her to the hospital. The diagnosis: exhaustion and mild anemia. When she woke, Chief Aide sat beside her bed, his face worried. "You've been working without rest," he scolded gently. She smiled weakly. "You can't rest when children still suffer." He held her hand firmly. "You can't help them if you collapse. Even angels must breathe." She laughed softly. "Then I'll breathe. For a while." During her recovery, the chief took over the foundation's operations. He visited the poor himself, something no one had imagined years before. He sat on bare floors, held sick children, and prayed with mothers. The media called it the Billionaire's redemption. Grace watched the footage from her hospital bed, smiling through tears. "You've learned well, Chief," she whispered to the TV. "Now you're the listener." When she returned to work weeks later, the staff celebrated. The children ran to her, hugging her legs. One boy handed her a drawing. It showed her with angel wings standing beside a fountain. "Is that me?" she asked. "Yes," the boy said proudly. "You're the angel that made the water sing." Grace smiled, touched beyond words. That night, as she and the chief walked through the mansion garden, the fountain sparkled under the moonlight. "You know," he said quietly, "that fountain used to sound like loneliness. Now it sounds like home." She looked at him, eyes soft. because now it listens. Years later, the world still remembered the boy who heard. The foundation had built schools for the deaf across West Africa. Each one bore a bronze plaque that read, "Silence is not emptiness. It's waiting to be heard." Grace became an advisor to several governments, helping to reform healthcare systems. Chief Ade retired from business and dedicated his wealth to humanitarian causes. Adeola grew into a bright young man, studying medicine so he could help others hear like Grace helped me. One evening, as the sun set over Lagos Lagoon, the three of them sat by the water's edge. Adeola, now 16, asked, "Mama Grace, do you think God really planned all this?" She smiled gently. "Everything starts with a whisper, Adeola. Sometimes we just need to be quiet enough to hear it." The boy nodded, his eyes reflecting the gold of the setting sun. Chief Aide looked at them, gratitude softening his features. "Grace," he said slowly, "you didn't just heal my son. You healed me." She turned, smiling. "And you taught me that even the proud can learn to kneel." That night, a gentle rain fell. Grace walked alone to the garden fountain. She placed her hand on the water, whispering, "Daniel, I kept my promise. I listened." The wind brushed her hair like an unseen blessing. Inside, Adeola played a soft melody on his piano. The same hands that once couldn't hear now made the mansion sing. The notes rose through the air, mingling with the rain. Chief Aide stood by the doorway, listening with tears in his eyes. "This," he whispered, "is the sound of grace." The story of Grace and the billionaire spread beyond borders, translated into documentaries, books, and school plays. But in every version, the lesson stayed the same. True miracles don't start with power or wealth. They start with listening. And so, as every folktale ends beneath the African moon, when you hear silence, do not fear. Perhaps heaven is speaking softly. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Tell us in the comments, what lesson did you learn from Grace's journey? And where in the world are you watching from right now?